Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Understable Discourse in this week's edition of Chain Reaction, where we take a look at all the events that happened the previous weekend and any information that we can glean from it. Now, this past weekend, we didn't have a traditional Pro Tour event as we are nearing the end of the season, and all we have really left is the USDGC and the Pro Tour Championship, as well as the Match Play Championship. But nothing really significant happened this past weekend, except for a few events, and we'll kind of go through those. What we saw is very typical of the weekend leading up to USDGC, where the pros kind of split up, do their different things. Some play in different events, others go out and get time practicing in, a handful hop on socials and like whatnot to sell discs and engage with their fans, and a large number just decide to get some rest because of all the traveling, and the season is growing pretty long for most people. When it comes to events, though, there really was one, I would say, more significant event this past weekend, and that was the Go Throw Tour Championship going down at the Highland Brewing Company in Asheville, North Carolina. Now, yes, this is the Go Throw Tour Championship, and we haven't heard much about them this season. I know we were going to cover them, but the events kind of fell under the radar, and they really don't share a lot of information about their stuff. And I could go into quite a bit about how the Go Throw Tour went, but we're going to spend some time in a few weeks diving really closely into the Go Throw Tour, the events they had, and I would say how successful or unsuccessful the season was for them. So we'll get into all that at a future date. But so this event happened at the Highland Brewing Company in Asheville, North Carolina. It's a free private course located at the brewery itself, and it's a 4.5 on UDisc, so it looks like a pretty solid course. Pretty wooded for the most part, a lot of uphill and downhill, elevation change type shots. And there were 25 pros in the field for the MPO and 2 in the field for the FPO, which is pretty standard that we've seen with the Go Throw event, that the FPO side of the aisle is really not deep at all in any event this year. But being a relatively difficult wooded track, we saw some pretty competitive play between some young touring pros and some typical touring veterans. Now, a lot of the bigger name guys not here this weekend, even though technically they all very much qualified for the Go Throws Tour Championship. They weren't to be found, and that makes total sense. We did identify earlier this year that this would be a bit of a problem because it's USDGC week, and if you ask players like Gannon Burr, Anthony Barella, Adam Hammes, Calvin Heimberg, would you rather go play in a wooded track or get an extra bit of rest or an extra chance to practice ahead of USDGC? All of them chose USDGC, and that's not a surprise pretty much, I think, for anybody. But after the first round, a total of 5 strokes separated players like Greg Barsby and Austin Turner, who had a tie for the lead, and you have Zachary Nash and Matt Bell pretty close behind, and then you got guys like Tall Paul Oman, Raven Newsom, James Conrad, Noah Meinsma, even Kevin Jones, who are, not that many strokes back, within striking distance, of course. And so going into round 2, the battle started out pretty, I would say, heavily between Zach Nash and Greg Barsby, with Kevin Jones and Raven Newsom trying to push from the chase and third cards. Kevin Jones ultimately shooting a course record 10 under par, not to win the event, of course. And the back and forth was pretty close between Barsby and Nash until on hole 12, Barsby did trip up with a bit of a double bogey, and at that point, Nash kind of just had to play pretty consistent, and he did finish strong, taking down the victory for the MPO side. Over on the FPO side, Kat Murch absolutely dunked on her only other competitor by a total of 24 strokes, securing the win pretty handily, I would say. But when you're a touring pro like Kat Murch is, going up against someone in the mid 800 rated field, you really should be doing that. Wish we could see some more FPO players playing. I feel like there are a number of FPO players who could probably stand to use the extra events and some of the extra cash on the table, but I would tell you how much everybody won, but that information just really isn't made available anywhere. The Go Throw Tour doesn't seem to want to showcase any of that, and if they are, it's somewhere cryptic, and I couldn't find it. But we'll like I said, we'll take a real deep dive into the Go Throw Tour in the future. Look at the numbers that we can find. Look at the event stats and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of wild to really look at. A few other smaller events did happen this weekend. Emerson Keith edged out a victory over Connor Rock at the 12th annual Buffalo Run in Oklahoma. And the European field stuck around and competed in Charlotte at the Carolina Clash, a pretty solid event, with Mari Vilman taking down the event over players like Cole Radalin, Chandler Kramer, Jessen Immonen, Joel Freeman, Robert Burridge, Jona Heinonen, and Astori Tukkanen. So a pretty competitive field at this event. This was Mari's first win ever on U.S. soil. And I think he could be a definite contender for USDGC. He has a pretty tough history there in the past, but it's been a bit. He's a different player than he was then. I think he could be a solid competitor this upcoming weekend. And honestly, it's a shame that we're not going to see him for the Tour Championship due to his requirement to go back for mandated military training in Estonia. Now, speaking of USDGC, one event that did go down that everyone is always excited about is the Monday qualifying. That happened today. I would argue that right here, we at Understable Discourse are one of the first people to report on this, as the event ended maybe only 30 minutes ago. So today was the Monday qualifying for USDGC and for Throw Pink. Let's not forget about Throw Pink. On the ladies' side, Kona Star Montgomery was the only one who finished under par for the event, and so she secured the first entry. The second entry goes to Eva Lutsenko, a 12-year-old from South Carolina. Huge congrats to her. Really excited to see what she does at Throw Pink. I know it's a big event for women, all over the place. So really excited to see her compete in that. On the MPO side, which literally, like I said, just finished up, it was a pretty wild one down the stretch. All eyes were on Linus Karlsson as he approached the tee of hole 18, because the way the qualifier works, if you don't know, is the top 5 spots on the MPO side get into USDGC. And that's even the case when it comes to things like ties. So if there's a tie for the 5th place spot, then they all get in. And so Linus was currently sitting at 3 under par, tied with Danny Beauchamp and Whit Stevenson, and they were all tied, ready to get in. And so Danny and Whit are sitting in the clubhouse kind of waiting to see what Linus does, because he needs to get a par or better, and he's in. But if he gets a birdie, then it kicks Danny and Whit out of the event. And so Linus eventually did get the birdie, bringing him to -4, and Danny and Whit lost their qualifying spots. I can't imagine playing a really decent, solid round and having to sit around waiting, only to have your fate determined by somebody else on the very last hole of their round. That's got to be tough. Solid playing from Danny and Whit, but they are not going to be making it in this year. So at some point, at that point right then and there, after Linus had kind of secured himself that position, -4 was the number that had to be hit. And there were only 3 players left on the course who had any chance of making it to that mark, and that was Parker Welk, who would need 3 birdies to make it to -4, Albert Tom, who also needed 3 birdies to get to -4, and Jared Stahl, who only needed 2 birdies to make it there. But as we all know, down the stretch, USDGC 16, 17, and 18. 16 definitely gettable. 17 a very, very difficult hole, one that can result in ending everyone's weekend. And hole 18 is one of the hardest, I would say, hole 18s on tour when it comes to just down the stretch pressure, what you have to do to get it done. Very, very difficult hole. So Parker Welk goes on to birdie hole 16. He's out. He cannot qualify at this point any further. He could ace hole 17, and there's just no way. It's not going to work. And so both Albert and Jared birdie hole 16. So they move on to 17, and that's unfortunately where Tom goes on to par 17, but bogey 18, knocking himself out. And that leaves just Jared Stoll on the course, who gets the par on 17, and all he has to do is birdie hole 18, and he is going to make it into USDGC. I can't imagine the pressure of stepping up to that hole, knowing that you've got to birdie it. A very, very difficult hole. Oftentimes, your entire outcome of the hole is determined by the result of your drive and how good your drive is. And so I wish I could tell you that he did it, because he didn't. Hole 18, notoriously difficult, did take another victim. And so Jared Stoll would not be qualifying for USDGC. And that means your 5 Monday qualifiers are Lucas Carmichael, who finished at 6 under par, leading the field. And then all tied at 4 under par, you have Linus Karlsson, Bo McLaughlin, Derek Saar, and Kyle Kriekhaus. Sorry if I mispronounced your last name, Kyle. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do it to you. But that's kind of it for today's episode of Chain Reaction. Not too much happened this past weekend. We have a really big show coming up on Wednesday as we dive deep into USDGC. Talk about the course. There are some significant changes this year. Some things we saw. A new pin position or two being added. And it's going to be wild. The last major of the year. A lot of people who I believe are in contention for this one to win. There's a lot to go over on Wednesday. So tune in for an absolutely packed show of everything you could ever hope to see, from course breakdowns, player profiles, and our predictions as always. But thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's episode. Really appreciate it. The home stretch is around the corner as we only have a couple events left. So if you like what you heard today, make sure to leave a like, put a comment down below who you think is going to win USDGC ahead of this week's preview episode. And obviously, if you could hit the subscribe button, it's a great way to support the growth of our channel. But thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day. And we'll see you in a couple days for the USDGC preview and breakdown. Until then, this has been Understable Discourse.